All right, diving right in today. Inner speech, that voice in your head, that constant mental chatter we all have going on. It's
Well,
fascinating, right? So basic to being human, using words even when we're not speaking out loud.
yeah, definitely. And it really gets to the heart of so many things. Language, obviously, but also how we think, become aware of ourselves, even how we connect to the world. Huge for philosophers who, as you know, just love to dig into the very nature of stuff.
And that's our deep dive today, what those philosophers have been grappling with when it comes to this inner voice. But first, I gotta ask, what are we actually talking about when we say inner speech? I mean, it seems straightforward, but I bet there are nuances galore.
You're spot on.
Yeah.
It's easy to fall into the trap of that everyday kind of casual understanding. So to get a bit more precise, think of it this way. Inner speech is a mental thing, right? Happens in your mind. But it's also tied to, well, natural language,
Mm.
like English, French, Mandarin, or even sign language if that's your primary mode of communication. And another key point, it's something we usually have, that direct personal access to. We experience it from the inside, so to speak.
Okay, so it's not like some universal brain language we're born with. It's based on the actual languages we learn.
Exactly. That's what we mean by it being keyed to a natural language. It develops alongside the languages we acquire. So, yeah, if you grew up speaking French, your inner speech is going to be, well, in French. And that introspective access bit, that means it's a first-person experience. You know you're having inner speech in a way that no one looking at you from the outside could ever directly observe.
It's that private inner world, essentially.
Yeah. But even with this seemingly simple definition, it throws open some, well, pretty significant philosophical doors. Like, for starters, do we have introspective access to all of our inner mental language? Is everything going on in there something we could directly hear with that inner ear, so to speak? Then there's the biggie, is what we're calling inner speech, really speech at all, like a kind of silent speaking? Or is it more akin to thought itself or, maybe some other category altogether? And then there's the question of how it actually happens in our minds. Are we running full, grammatically correct sentences in our heads? Or is it more about, activating key linguistic elements, concepts, words, but maybe not in full-blown sentence form?
Wow. So many layers, classic philosophers, right? Digging into every nook and cranny of a definition. But I'm guessing most of the focus tends to be on that voice part, the auditory experience, since that's what most of us immediately think of.
That's right. A lot of the philosophical head scratching does center on that perceived auditory aspect. I mean, it's in the name, inner speech, right?
Hmm.
And that focus is partly driven by the fact that the majority of the scientific research on inner speech has explored this kind of inner speech that has that, auditory quality to it.
Makes sense. Focus on what we can actually, in some way, measure.
Exactly. Oh, and a quick aside before we jump in,
Mhm.
it's worth mentioning private speech, which is when we actually talk to ourselves out loud.
Like when I'm trying to figure out something complicated and start muttering to myself.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there might be some overlap with some of the things we discuss about inner speech, but they're definitely not the same thing. One's silent, one's audible.
Gotcha. Inner is silent, private is spoken. Okay, so let's wade into some of those philosophical waters. Where do we even begin with trying to figure out this inner voice?
Well, one really prominent view, and kind of a surprising one at first, is the actual speech view. And this isn't just saying inner speech is like talking in your head, metaphorically. This view argues that inner speech is quite literally a kind of silent speaking.
Whoa, hold on. Literally silent speaking. That seems like a pretty bold claim.
It is. And it's actually held by quite a few philosophers out there.
Yeah.
Carruthers, Martinez Manrique, and Vicente Gawker. Those are just a few names. And you can even trace some of the ideas back to folks like Vygotsky and Ryle.
I mean, I get that it feels like talking sometimes, but when I'm just thinking, it's more like fleeting ideas, impressions, not like I'm actually forming sentences, even silently. How does that work if it's truly silent speaking?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's the main challenge this view has to tackle head on. If inner speech often has that auditory imagery component, that feeling of hearing, even though there's no actual external sound, then how can that mental image of a sound count as a real linguistic token, like an actual instance of a word being used?
It's like a mental image of a cat isn't an actual cat, so why would a mental sound of the word cat be using the word cat?
Exactly. That's the core of the problem.
Hmm.
So how do those who hold this view, those who say it is actual speech, respond? Well, one pretty compelling argument comes from a philosopher named Sam Wilkinson. He makes this crucial distinction between imagery and imagination. His point is, Just because inner speech might use mental imagery doesn't mean the whole experience is just an act of imagination. It could be more than that. He argues that the imagery can be, the medium, the way a linguistic token exists in our minds when we're doing something like making an inner assertion. The image isn't the token itself, it's the way the token shows up internally.
Okay, so the mental sound of the word is how my mind forms the silent assertion, but it's the assertion itself that's the real linguistic action. But isn't imagery usually about representing things we perceive, like objects or sounds? How can it be the word itself?
That is a really good point. And, it's a common critique.
Yeah.
But here's where things get really interesting. Some philosophers try to bridge that gap by looking into, well, the metaphysics of words. What actually makes something a word token in the first place?
Oh boy, metaphysics. This is getting deep.
It is, but it's important. A philosopher named Wade Monroe, for instance, argues that what makes a token of a word type is the fact that, well, it's generated by our tacit knowledge of that word, our implicit understanding of its meaning, its grammatical role, its sound, all that jazz. So according to Monroe, this means that inner speech can involve real word tokens because it's drawing on that same underlying knowledge of language.
Yeah.
J.T.M. Miller has a related view, suggesting that word tokens are really just bundles of properties. You've got semantic properties, phonetic, grammatical, etc. And he suggests that inner speech might involve these mental bundles getting activated, even if there's no physical sound. So the focus shifts from that outward sound to the underlying stuff, the linguistic structure and knowledge that give a word its meaning and function.
So it's less about hearing the word in my head and more about my brain activating all the linguistic info connected to that word.
Precisely. But even setting those more theoretical points aside, are there any, more down-to-earth arguments in support of this view? The view that inner speech really is speech.
I'm all ears.
Well, there are several.
Yeah.
One is what you might call the developmental argument. It looks at how our language abilities unfold, as we grow up. It starts with Piaget's idea of egocentric speech. That's that phase where kids talk to themselves out loud like they're narrating their own actions.
Right, so that with kids, like they're figuring things out by talking through them.
Exactly. Then Vygotsky came along and argued that this out loud self-talk gradually turns into inner speech, like it gets internalized as we get older. But the crucial part is, Vygotsky argued it keeps its basic nature as speech. It just becomes covert, hidden from view. So in this line of thinking, inner speech is seen as this direct descendant of our actual spoken language, evolves right out of it.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Makes intuitive sense. As kids mature, that self-talk just goes underground, so to speak.
Another big argument focuses on speech acts, which are, well, actions we perform using language, like making a statement, asking a question, giving a command.
Right, those doing things with words,
Yeah.
examples.
Yes. Now, when we introspect, when we look inward, it often feels like we're performing these speech acts in our inner speech, like we're asserting things to ourselves, asking ourselves questions, giving ourselves silent commands. So the argument here is that if we can carry out these same linguistic actions internally, then inner speech must be a form of speech, right? It's not just thinking about these actions, it's doing them in our minds.
I definitely get that. Like when I'm arguing with myself about something or silently giving myself a pep talk.
Exactly. And then you've got the functional parallels argument. It points out that inner speech seems to serve a lot of the same purposes in our cognitive lives as outer speech does, like, focusing our attention, motivating ourselves, weighing up options. And you also see structural similarities, like using shorter, more clipped forms in our inner speech when the context is clear, and more elaborate, complete sentences when we're working through something more complex. So these parallels in both function and structure really point toward the idea that inner and outer speech might be different sides of the same coin, just different ways our language faculty gets used.
Like different settings on the same engine.
A perfect analogy. And one more key argument is what Gregory called the imagination contrast argument. He focuses on the difference between, on the one hand, imagining yourself speaking, like an actor rehearsing lines, and on the other hand, the experience of actually doing inner speech as you think. And he argues that this subjective difference we feel between those two things is like the difference between representing speech and actually doing it. An actor isn't actually speaking, they're representing speech. But in a real conversation, you are speaking. So Gregory says it's the same with inner speech. Imagined speech is a representation, inner speech is the real deal, just done silently.
That's a really neat comparison. So even though there's no sound coming out, the way it feels, the role it plays in our thinking, all that points to it actually being a form of speech, at least for those who hold this view.
Yes. And there are other philosophers who offer similar but slightly different perspectives, like Gerens, for instance. He calls inner speech imaginary action. but then he clarifies what he means. He's not saying it's not speaking. He sees it as covert speaking, like the action of speaking, just done silently. And Russell had this idea that some kinds of inner speech, specifically the ones where you're imagining speaking with a specific intention, can actually be, in some ways, tantamount to a genuine assertion. Like it blurs the line between imagination and really making a statement. He even suggests that maybe all inner speech could ultimately be understood in this way.
A lot to unpack there. This actual speech view is definitely making me think about that inner voice in a whole new light. Like, it's not just passively reflecting my thoughts. It is my thoughts, in a way, at least according to this view. But speaking of thoughts, how do philosophers understand how inner speech relates to, well, our thinking processes?
Ah, yes. That is the next big question. And it's a complex one, as you can imagine. Generally, philosophers have laid out three broad ways in which inner speech and thought might be connected. And it's important to remember these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So first, inner speech might be a way of expressing our thoughts. Second, it might be a tool that helps us to think more effectively. And third, it might sometimes actually be a form of thought itself.
Okay, let's break those down one by one, starting with that first one. How could inner speech express our thoughts?
Right, so this idea often gets linked to something called the language of thought hypothesis. It's also sometimes called mentalese. The basic idea is that our most fundamental thoughts, the bedrock stuff, happens in this, well, pre-verbal, non-natural language, this mentalese. If that's true, then inner speech, which uses a learned language like English or Spanish, would be a way of, translating those deeper wordless thoughts into something we can grasp more easily. Like an internal translator turning those raw thoughts into a language we can hear in our minds.
So my inner voice, speaking in English, is actually just the tip of the iceberg, expressing these deeper thoughts happening in mentalese underneath.
That's the gist of it. And it fits with a lot of work in cognitive science on how we produce language, like Levelt's model, which basically says speaking is about conveying a pre-existing message that's already conceptually structured. If inner speech is a form of speech, then it might work the same way. Expressing this pre-verbal message. A philosopher named Carruthers, for instance, argues that inner speech is how we get our primary metacognitive access to our beliefs. It's by verbally expressing them that we become aware of them.
Hold on, I'm going to need to back up. Metacognitive access.
Right, sorry. Metacognition is basically, well, thinking about thinking. It's our awareness of our own mental processes. So Carruthers is saying that it's when we put a belief into words in our inner speech that we really become conscious of holding that belief.
So I only really know I believe something when I say it to myself in my head.
That's how Carruthers sees it, yes. And there's another interesting idea from Jackendoff, who draws this line between conceptual thought and auditory imagery. He puts inner speech in that imagery category. And he says only the auditory imagery is conscious. The deeper thought remains unconscious. Bermudez and Prince have a slightly different take. They suggest that we often figure out our thoughts by, paying attention to the inner speech sentences that we would use to express those thoughts.
It's like I listen to the potential words and then go, oh, that's what I was thinking.
Sort of, yes.
Yeah,
Like we infer the content of our thinking from the way we'd verbalize it.
Clever. But does that mean our thoughts always exist in some complete form before we put them into words? Or could inner speech play a role in shaping our thoughts as well?
That's a great question. And actually, Bermudez later refined his view to suggest that, yeah, inner speech can actually play a role in forming the thought it expresses. Like the act of putting it into words helps to solidify and clarify it. So it's not always a one-way street with a fully formed thought getting translated into words. The inner speech process itself can be part of how the thought develops. And of course, if you're leaning towards that actual speech view, the one we talked about earlier, and you believe speech inherently expresses thought, then naturally that would apply to inner speech too.
Okay, so inner speech is potentially doing double duty, making our thoughts more concrete and maybe even helping to generate or solidify them. But what about that second possibility? The idea that inner speech helps us think more effectively. What are some of the ways it could be doing that?
Right, so there are several ideas floating around about this.
Yeah.
A big one is its role in working memory. That's our short-term memory, where we hold and manipulate information. Baddeley's theory, which is pretty influential in cognitive science, proposes that we use inner speech to, silently rehearse stuff, like words or numbers. It's called the phonological loop. We basically keep that information active in our minds by repeating it to ourselves.
Totally. I do that all the time, like repeating a phone number or a grocery list in my head.
Exactly. Building on Vygotsky's work, some researchers argue that inner speech is also how we direct our own attention. Like, External speech can be used to get someone else to pay attention to something,
Yeah.
right? Well, inner speech might do the same thing for ourselves. It's like shining a mental spotlight on whatever we're verbalizing internally. And on top of that, there's quite a bit of empirical research suggesting that inner speech is involved in executive functions. Those are those higher level mental skills, like planning, task switching, controlling impulses.
So it's like our inner speech is helping to organize and manage all the mental stuff going on.
Exactly. And then Monroe, who we talked about earlier, takes this even further. He argues that inner speech isn't just helpful for certain types of thinking. He thinks it's absolutely essential. Like he uses the example of doing complex math in your head. You might find yourself silently reciting intermediate numbers, right? Keeping them active in your working memory. Well, according to Baddeley's model, only sensory representations can be stored in working memory. So Monroe argues that we need to actually interpret that inner speech, like the mental sound of 6 needs to be understood as the number 6 for the calculation to continue.
It's not enough to just hold the info. You have to actually activate its meaning to work with it.
Precisely. And then there's the whole connection between inner speech and abstract thought. Some philosophers who are into neo-empiricism and embodied cognition have proposed that inner speech is how we grasped those abstract concepts in the first place. It gives them a kind of grounding in our sensory and motor experiences through that internal perception and production of language. Dove, for instance, sees language and often inner speech specifically as a scaffold or a tool for thinking about stuff that doesn't have direct sensory counterpart.
Like using a concrete word to grasp more slippery, abstract idea.
Exactly. And finally, if we think of the mind as this collection of interconnected systems, modules, whatever you want to call them, well, language, and specifically the system that produces language, might be uniquely suited to integrate the outputs of all those different systems. Because language is combinatorial, it can take bits from here and there and put them together. Carruthers has suggested this role for inner speech, and it fits with other folks like Bars and Dennett.
So inner speech could be like the central communication hub in the brain, letting all the different parts share information. Fascinating.
Right. Now, that third possibility we mentioned about the relationship between inner speech and thought,
Yeah.
that was maybe the most radical. It's the idea that, at least sometimes, inner speech might be the thought itself.
Whoa, hold on. So the actual process of thinking, the thought unfolding,
That's right.
could be happening in the form of that internal monologue.
Exactly. Gawker, who we talked about earlier with the semantic content view, he argues that all conceptual thought, all the thinking that involves concepts, actually occurs through inner speech. And remember, he very carefully distinguishes this from mere auditory imagery. For Gawker, thinking is tokening natural language items in specific neural states. So like the mental act of bringing those words into being in your mind, that's the thought itself. Frankish has a somewhat softer version of this. He says inner speech can help us break down big, complex problems into smaller, more manageable chunks, like taking a complex thought and making it digestible for our brains. He also suggests that some inner speech acts as a conscious commitment, like a mental stance that influences how we act later on. It's similar to making commitments to other people through spoken language.
So when I tell myself I really need to finish that report, that's not just expressing a wish, it's making a commitment to myself.
That's how Frankish sees it. And Monroe has this idea that inner speech episodes that come with a strong feeling of rightness attached to them, well, those actually function as judgments, like they end an inquiry and lead to a decision or action.
It's that feeling of certainty that goes with the thought. Like, yes, that's the right way to think about it.
Exactly. Compa has a really broad definition of inner speech. He says it's any mental event that significantly engages the speech production system. So for him, any thought that has a meaning and a syntactic structure would be inner speech, even if we're not conscious of the sound aspects. This goes against that language of thought hypothesis, the mentally is idea. He's saying, no, thought itself is linguistic, at least structured thought.
So for Compa, the building blocks of thought are actually these linguistic elements.
That's right. And one last thing to mention is the connection to unsymbolized thought. This is the experience of having a thought or understanding without any words, images, or symbols coming to mind. Some researchers think these might happen when an inner speech episode gets cut off really early in the process. Like you start to generate inner speech, but it doesn't make it to the level of conscious awareness. But the meaning is still there.
Like the thought is trying to come out in words but gets stuck before it reaches the surface.
Yeah, that's the idea. So as you can see, the connection between inner speech and thought is a huge area of debate, still very much a live philosophical issue.
Absolutely. It seems like figuring out inner speech might be a key to figuring out thought itself.
Could be. Now, Moving on to those content-based theories of inner speech. These theories try to get at what inner speech is actually about, what it represents.
Okay, content. Like, is it about the sound of the words, the meaning of the words, or something else?
Yes, exactly. Think of it like a news report versus the events it's reporting on. You've got the report itself, and then you've got the actual stuff happening out in the world. These theories want to figure out what our inner speech is reporting on, so to speak. What's it pointing to in our minds?
Got it. So, are there different types of content theories?
There are. We can broadly group them into three main camps: the phonological content view, the semantic content view, and then views that say it's a mix of both. And you're right, these connect back to that whole actual speech debate.
Oh, I had a feeling they would. So, phonological content, that would be the view that it's all about the sounds of language, right?
You got it. This view says that when we have inner speech, what's really happening is we're mentally representing the sounds of words, either as phonemes, those abstract sound units, or as phones, those more concrete spoken versions of those units.
So, it's like hearing the individual sounds of words in my head.
Yeah, essentially. But even within this view, there's debate. Are we representing the more abstract underlying sounds or the more specific pronounced sounds?
Okay, so even sound has levels. Now, what kind of arguments support this view? The phonological one, I mean.
Well, for one, the experience itself often feels similar to actually hearing ourselves speak. Like there's that subjective resemblance. And that makes sense if both involve representing similar auditory properties. Another point is that we can do things like judge rhymes in our inner speech. Tell whether two words rhyme. And that suggests we must be representing sounds because rhyming is all about sound. And some argue that representing these sounds is what lets us know which language we're thinking in.
Ah, so that's how my brain knows if I'm doing inner speech in English or Spanish. It's like I can hear the difference.
Exactly. Now, a prominent version of this phonological view comes from Jackanoff, who we mentioned earlier. He argues that auditory content is the only content of inner speech. He doesn't think we actually think in natural language. He says our real thinking is unconscious and conceptual. Inner speech is just this conscious auditory image of sound structure. It expresses the thought, but the understanding happens at a deeper unconscious level.
Wait, so the words in my head don't actually have meaning at that level, just sounds.
That's Jackanoff's view, yeah. He even admits it's kind of counterintuitive. Like, how could we be conscious of a string of sounds without also being conscious of what they mean? He later refined his view a bit, adding in a sense of pronunciation, a feeling of meaningfulness, and the actual meaning itself. But he still maintained that only the pronunciation and that feeling are consciously part of inner speech itself. Now, another philosopher, Langland Hassan, he's also into the phonological view, but he's a bit more cautious. He's worried about what's called the binding problem. Basically, how can one mental state represent both sound and meaning at the same time? They seem like such different things. So he suggests maybe inner speech is actually multiple mental states happening at the same time, and it's the phonological part that we experience as inner speech.
So maybe sound and meaning are processed in parallel, but we only really hear the sound part.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. Okay, so that's the phonological camp. Now let's switch gears and look at the semantic content view.
The meaning-focused view, right?
Right. This one says that inner speech is all about representing meaning, the meanings of words and sentences, not their sounds. One very strong version of this comes from Gawker, who argues that inner speech only has semantic content, no auditory content at all, no sound experience. He thinks that auditory imagery, that feeling of hearing, is actually a separate thing, happening alongside inner speech but not part of it.
Hmm.
And he says this imagery is what tricks us into thinking inner speech has sounds, even though it doesn't.
So for Gawker, it's like pure meaning playing out in my head, and the voice is just an illusion.
Exactly. And this fits with his idea that we literally think in words, like the meaning of words is the medium of thought itself. And he rejects that mentalese idea, the language of thought.
Thought just as language for him, at least in terms of meaning.
Yes. Now, another philosopher, Bermudez, he also supports the semantic view, but he allows for that auditory experience. He just says it's non-representational, like it's there, but it's not representing anything. For him, only the meaning is being represented.
Okay, I think I'm following, but how do you explain things like judging rhymes if there's no sound representation?
Well, he argues that you don't need to represent the sounds themselves to do that. You can recognize that cat and hat rhyme based on something else, like some underlying conceptual connection between the words.
Yeah.
And then there's another version of this view which says that inner speech is genuine speech, like we discussed earlier, and therefore its content must be the same as outer speech, which is mainly semantic.
Okay, so we've got the sound folks, the meaning folks, and now, as expected, we get to the folks who want to combine the two.
Right.
Mixed contents views.
You know it. The mixed content folks say inner speech typically has both phonological and semantic content simultaneously. But then, within that camp, there's a split. Some say both types of content are in a single mental state, and others say they're represented in multiple states.
Single state meaning, like one mental experience holds both the sound and the meaning of the inner word.
Yes, exactly. Like, think of Carruthers. He's a single state guy. He says inner speech works like this. Your brain generates a representation of word sounds, and then your speech comprehension system interprets those sounds and assigns meaning. And then all that info, the sound and the meaning, gets bundled together into a single mental event. He compares it to how we see an object. Like, we experience the color and shape of an object as bound together, as features of one thing.
So my brain takes the inner sound and the meaning and fuses them into one experience of inner speech.
That's the idea. Now, Monroe also has a single-state view, but he adds something else to the mix. He thinks inner speech also represents the likelihood that the content is true, like how confident we are in what we're thinking. He says this is needed for inner speech to act as a judgment. So for him, a single mental state in inner speech holds the sounds, the meaning, and the truth value all together.
Okay, one mental package deal. Now, what about the multiple state views?
These views often take inspiration from models of language production, like Levelt's model. They say that the different aspects of inner speech, the meaning, the syntax, the sounds, are represented in different mental states that are happening at the same time. Martinez-Manrique and Vicente, for instance, they talk about an activity view of inner speech. They highlight that both inner and outer speech are complex, involving different levels of representation. But they say inner speech is more about these interacting representations, not the actual, physical act of speaking.
So different parts of my language system are working together, but they don't necessarily combine into one single sensation of a voice.
Right. And Hehel, another philosopher, he has a similar view. He says the semantic content of inner speech doesn't have any sensory feel to it. It's only the auditory phonological content that gives us that experience. And Patel, he throws vocal content into the mix, the representation of a specific voice.
Yeah.
He says that's what gives inner speech its unity.
So it's like my brain is representing whose voice it is, even internally.
Yeah, that's Patel's idea. Now, the problem with these multiple state views is, well, what counts as inner speech itself? That's all these separate things. How do we define it? But the benefit, according to folks who support this view, is that it lets us put related things like unsymbolized thought on a continuum with more fully fledged inner speech. Remember, unsymbolized thought is where you have a thought without any words, images, or symbols coming to mind. So maybe that's just the semantic and syntactic content without the sound. And it's worth pointing out that a lot of these views, both the mixed content and the phonological ones, don't necessarily say inner speech happens in natural language. They say it represents natural language. Like the phonological content represents the sounds of a natural language, and the semantic content might be in a separate language of thought, like mentalese.
Okay, so many layers here, but it seems like the take-home message is that there's no simple answer to what's the content of inner speech.
Nope, definitely not. And that's what makes it so interesting to philosophers, right?
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, our outline talks about how inner speech connects to pragmatics. The study of how language is used in context. How does that apply to inner speech?
Good question. I mean, most of philosophy of language focuses on, how we use language to communicate with each other. So applying that to inner speech is all about looking at how language functions within our own minds.
So, are the rules the same when I'm talking to myself as when I'm talking to someone else?
That's one of the big questions.
Yeah.
And one area where this really comes up is with speech acts. Remember those actions we perform with language?
Making statements, asking questions, that kind of thing.
Right. And as we said, the feeling that we're performing these acts in our inner speech is one argument for the actual speech view. But there's a problem. The traditional way philosophers analyze speech acts, like Austin and Searle, is all about conventions. Shared understandings between speaker and listener. And that's hard to apply to inner speech. If it's just me in my head, who am I cooperating with? Gregory points this out specifically.
It's like, can I have a conversation with myself if I'm both sides of the conversation?
Exactly. But some philosophers have a different view of speech acts. They focus on the expression of mental states, like an assertion expresses a belief, a question expresses a desire for information. So according to this view, inner speech could still be a kind of speech act, as long as it's expressing those internal states.
So even if I'm not following the same rules as I would